The Japanese-Soviet Neutrality Pact of April 1941 was honored by both sides even during the most desperate phases of World War II, even as Japan's ally Germany fought for its survival against the Soviet Union. The pact traces directly to a Japanese military defeat at Khalkhin Gol in 1939. The specific strategic redirection that defeat produced, abandoning expansion into Siberia in favor of expansion into Southeast Asia and the Pacific, led directly to the attack on Pearl Harbor 7 months later. One border battle on a Mongolian river determined that Japan would fight America instead of Russia, and that Stalin could fight Germany without simultaneously fighting Japan. This episode traces that battle. The Khalkhin Gol conflict arose from a long-disputed border between Mongolia, a Soviet client state, and Manchukuo, the Japanese puppet state established in occupied Manchuria, specifically over the precise location of the boundary relative to the Khalkhin River. Japanese and Soviet forces had clashed repeatedly along this and other disputed Manchurian-Mongolian, Soviet border sections throughout the 1930s. But the 1939 engagement escalated into a sustained large-scale conflict involving tens of thousands of troops, hundreds of tanks, and significant air combat on both sides, making it one of the largest mechanized battles fought anywhere in the world prior to the German invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941. The conflict was never formally declared as a war by either side, allowing both Tokyo and Moscow to manage it as a limited border incident, rather than acknowledge it as a full-scale military confrontation. A specific faction within the Japanese Imperial Army, particularly concentrated in the Kwantung Army's command structure in occupied Manchuria, had advocated since the early 1930s for what historians describe as the Strike North strategy, expanding Japanese territorial control into Soviet Siberia, exploiting what Japanese strategists believed was Soviet military weakness following Stalin's purges of the Red Army Officer Corps between 1936 and 1938, which had removed or executed a substantial proportion of experienced senior Soviet commanders. The Kwantung Army's field commanders, operating with significant autonomy from Tokyo's central military and political leadership, had a documented history of escalating border incidents and territorial provocations, specifically to test Soviet resolve and capability, and to advance their own strategic preference for northern expansion over the competing Strike South factions, preference for expansion into China and Southeast Asia. Stalin's military purges had indeed removed a substantial proportion of experienced Soviet senior officers, and Japanese intelligence assessments of resulting Soviet weakness were not unreasonable given the scale of the purges. The specific miscalculation was in assuming that institutional disruption at senior command levels would translate directly into battlefield ineffectiveness at the operational and tactical level. The Soviet Union's specific response, appointing General Georgy Zhukov, a relatively junior but exceptionally capable commander who had survived the purges, to take direct command of Soviet forces at Khalkhin Gol, demonstrated that the Red Army retained substantial operational competence, despite its officer corps' disruption. Zhukov's appointment and his subsequent conduct of the battle would prove to be the single most consequential personnel decision the Soviet military made before the German invasion, 2 years later. Zhukov's specific tactical approach at Khalkhin Gol was the systematic application of combined arms doctrine, coordinating massed artillery, armor, and air support with an operational precision that Japanese forces had not previously encountered from Soviet opponents. Following the initial border clashes in May and June 1939, Zhukov spent weeks building up Soviet-Mongolian forces and supply lines, including the logistically difficult task of transporting fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements across hundreds of kilometers of largely roadless steppe to reach the remote battle area. By late August, Soviet-Mongolian forces had achieved numerical and material superiority sufficient to launch a major offensive. The specific operational plan, a classic double-envelopment maneuver using armored and cavalry forces to encircle the Japanese 6th Army from both flanks simultaneously, while artillery and air support suppressed Japanese defensive positions. The Soviet offensive launched on August 20, 1939, achieved its encirclement objective by August 25, trapping substantial elements of the Japanese 6th Army within a pocket that Soviet artillery and air power then systematically destroyed. Japanese commanders attempted counterattacks to break the encirclement. These failed against the coordinated Soviet defensive and offensive operations. By early September, organized Japanese resistance within the pocket had effectively ceased, though sporadic fighting continued until a ceasefire was negotiated on September 16, 1939. Coincidentally, just as Germany's invasion of Poland was triggering the formal start of World War II in Europe. The specific timing meant that the battle that would redirect Japan's entire strategic orientation concluded in the same weeks that the European War, which Japan's eventual alliance with Germany would connect it to, began. The Japanese Imperial General Staff's deliberations following the Khalkhin Gol defeat are extensively documented in post-war historical analysis, including testimony from surviving Japanese officers and captured Japanese military planning documents. The defeat produced a specific and decisive shift in internal Japanese strategic debate. The Strike North faction, whose theoretical framework had just been tested and had failed decisively against actual Soviet capability, lost its dominant position in Japanese strategic planning. The Strike South faction, advocating territorial expansion into Southeast Asia and the Pacific to secure oil, rubber, tin, and other resources that Japan's industrial and military expansion required, gained correspondingly decisive influence. The specific strategic logic: if the Soviet Union could not be defeated cheaply, and Japan required additional resources to sustain its war in China and its broader industrial economy, expansion toward the resource-rich but more militarily vulnerable Southeast Asian colonial territories became the more viable strategic option. The Japanese-Soviet Neutrality Pact, signed in April 1941, formalized the strategic redirection that Khalkhin Gol had initiated. The pact committed both nations to mutual non-aggression and territorial respect, and remarkably, given the subsequent course of World War II, both sides substantially honored it for the duration of the war. Even after Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941 created enormous pressure on Japan, as Germany's ally, to open a second front against the Soviet Union from the east. Japan did not attack the Soviet Union, even at the moments of greatest German military pressure on Moscow, including during the Battle of Moscow in the winter of 1941 to 1942. The specific reason Japan held to this commitment despite enormous pressure from its German ally, the Khalkhin Gol defeat, had convinced Japanese military planners that a war against the Soviet Union, even one coordinated with German pressure from the West, was not winnable at acceptable cost. The most consequential downstream effect of Khalkhin Gol's strategic redirection was Stalin's ability to transfer substantial Siberian and Far Eastern divisions to the European front during the critical autumn and winter of 1941. When German forces were approaching Moscow and Soviet military leadership faced the genuine possibility of the capital's capture, Soviet military intelligence, through sources including the famous spy Richard Sorge operating in Tokyo, had provided Stalin with credible assessments that Japan did not intend to attack Soviet territory in the near term, assessments that the Khalkhin Gol-driven strategic redirection had made accurate. Stalin's specific decision to transfer Siberian divisions westward, rather than retaining them against a potential Japanese threat, is documented by multiple military historians as a decisive factor in the successful Soviet defense of Moscow in December 1941 and the subsequent counteroffensive that pushed German forces back from the capital's outskirts. The historiographical debate about how decisive the Siberian division transfer was for the Battle of Moscow's outcome remains genuinely contested among military historians. Some scholars argue the transfer was one of several important factors, rather than singularly decisive, while others assign it greater weight. What is not contested: the transfer occurred. It involved substantial and experienced military formations. It was made possible specifically by the strategic confidence that Khalkhin Gol's outcome and the subsequent Neutrality Pact provided, and Moscow did not fall. The specific honest historical conclusion: Khalkhin Gol is a documented, significant contributing factor to one of the most consequential military outcomes of World War II, though the series does not claim it as the single deciding factor in a battle that involved millions of soldiers, multiple Soviet strategic decisions, and German logistical failures that were independently significant. General Georgy Zhukov's subsequent career, commanding the defense of Leningrad, the defense and counteroffensive at Moscow, the decisive Soviet victory at Stalingrad, and the final assault on Berlin, established him as arguably the most successful field commander of World War II by total strategic consequence achieved. The specific professional foundation for this career was Khalkhin Gol. It was Zhukov's first major independent command, his first demonstration of large-scale combined arms coordination, and the specific battle that established his reputation within the Soviet military hierarchy as a commander capable of achieving decisive results. Stalin's subsequent trust in Zhukov, placing him in command of the Soviet Union's most critical defensive battles at moments of genuine national survival, traces directly to the confidence Khalkhin Gol's outcome, established. The extraordinary landscape of the Mongolian steppe where Khalkhin Gol was fought is among the most vast and least populated environments on Earth. The eastern Mongolian grasslands, part of the same broader steppe ecosystem that produced the Mongol Empire under Genghis Khan, characterized by extreme seasonal temperature variation, enormous open horizons, and a nomadic pastoral culture that has persisted for millennia alongside the herds of horses, sheep, goats, and the occasional wild Przewalski's horse. One of the only true wild horse species remaining on Earth, reintroduced to Mongolia after near extinction. The specific historical irony, the steppe that produced the most successful land empire in human history under the Mongols became, 7 centuries later, the specific contested ground where two 20th-century industrial empires tested their mechanized armies against each other. Khalkhin Gol's specific contribution to the Decisive Battle series in its penultimate episode is the demonstration that a battle can redirect an entire global conflict's trajectory by eliminating one strategic option rather than by determining a final outcome directly. Plassey decided who controlled Bengal. Adwa decided whether Ethiopia would be colonized. Tsushima decided who won a specific war. Dien Bien Phu decided the end of an empire. Angamos decided ownership of a desert. Khalkhin Gol decided none of these things directly. It decided which of two competing strategic theories a single nation's military establishment would adopt, and that decision then redirected the entire subsequent course of the largest war in human history. The series' developing framework now includes this specific mechanism. Some decisive battles work not by winning a war, but by closing off one of the available futures a war might otherwise have taken. Khalkhin Gol's contemporary relevance in 2026 is specific and direct. The modern Russia-Japan relationship remains shaped by an unresolved territorial dispute over the Kuril Islands that traces to the broader 19th and 20th century territorial competition between the two nations, of which Khalkhin Gol was one significant chapter. The battle is also studied extensively in contemporary military academies as a foundational case study in combined arms warfare and in the strategic concept of victory disease, the specific phenomenon by which a faction's confidence in an untested strategic theory can persist until a real military test exposes its weaknesses. A lesson with continued relevance to contemporary military and strategic planning across multiple nations facing their own internal strategic debates about untested doctrines. Khalkhin Gol's specific lesson for the Decisive Battle series, as the series approaches its conclusion, is that the most consequential battles are sometimes the ones that prevent a different war from happening, rather than the ones that produce a war directly. Without Khalkhin Gol's outcome, Japan might have attacked the Soviet Union in 1941 in coordination with the German invasion, potentially producing Soviet defeat on two fronts simultaneously, a different outcome at Moscow, and an entirely different shape to World War II and the subsequent Cold War. The battle's significance lies precisely in the war it prevented, which is the most difficult kind of historical consequence to teach, because it requires explaining what did not happen and why. The series' final analytical contribution. History's most decisive moments include the wars that were avoided as much as the wars that were fought. An undeclared war on a river nobody had heard of, hundreds of tanks. A double envelopment borrowed from Hannibal's playbook 21 centuries later. A defeated faction whose theory was tested and failed. A neutrality pact that held through the worst pressure of the entire war. A spy named Sorge whose intelligence Stalin trusted. Siberian divisions moving west by train. Moscow not falling. Zhukov becoming the commander who would later take Berlin. Japan sailing south instead of marching north toward Pearl Harbor instead of Siberia. All of it, one battle fought between May and September of 1939 on a river called Khalkhin Gol that almost nobody outside Japan and Russia has been taught. The series concludes next episode with the Battle of Majuba Hill in 1881, the defeat that gave the Boers the confidence that produced the Anglo-Boer War and the foundations of modern South African history. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because the story doesn't end here, it evolves. The steppe is grazing land again. The consequences are still running. The series approaches its finale.